Welcome to Edible Education. Welcome again. And a special welcome to our audience in the Brower Center. We're delighted that you're with us here again tonight. Last time with you, we began to explore some of the impacts of industrial agriculture on the health of the planet's ecosystems and on the health of the humans who depend on those ecosystems for the services they provide. At least in the sense that the humans are consumers of food, we began to speak about their health and welfare. This time we're going to move that discussion forward another step by considering the people who help bring that food to the consumers. Or in the way that the I think, very poignant title of tonight's lecture puts it, the hands that feed you. So without more ado, I'm going to ask Michael Pollan, please welcome him, to come and introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Gary. It's a great privilege for me to be able to introduce my friend Eric Schlosser, and I hope he will be patient because I have a few things I want to say. I've known Eric for many years, and we've been, in addition to good friends, colleagues, comrades in this movement. Eric studied history at Princeton and was planning on an academic career. But while at Princeton, he studied with John McPhee, the New Yorker writer, the great New Yorker writer, who I think it's fair to say had a pretty profound influence on him. He went on to study at Oxford and found his way into journalism, writing about the drug war for the Atlantic Monthly magazine, which I think was the first time I saw his name in print. Sometime after that, he was approached by Rolling Stone magazine to write a story about the fast food industry, which evolved into his 2001 landmark book, Fast Food Nation, one of the most influential works of journalism in the past 20 years. How many of you have read Fast Food Nation? Quite a few, okay. I think I've read it 4 or 5 times, actually. Not because I didn't get it the first time, but because I teach it. I teach it in my food writing class. And I'm always impressed by when you read a book multiple times, you begin to see how it's constructed, by the depth of the reporting and the construction of the book. It's like this great sturdy house built of bricks, and every brick is a fact, a clear statement of fact, a statistic, an historical fact, and every 5th or 6th one of those bricks hits you like a shock or revelation. The case can be made that this book really launched the conversation about food, the politics of food that we've been having since around 2001. This conversation about how our food is produced and what it is doing to us, both individually and as a society. I don't think it was an accident. I was a beneficiary of that, and shortly after Fast Food Nation came out, the New York Times came to me and said, would I write an article about the meat industry? And that article led indirectly to Omnivore's Dilemma. Suddenly, there was a market for journalism about food and about how food was produced. But Eric's book is about a lot more than food, as he will be the first to tell you. His real subject is social justice. I've never asked him this, but I can imagine he identifies closely with Upton Sinclair, the author of The Jungle, which is an amazing book. And Sinclair thought he was writing a book about social justice, about corporations and their exploitation of the working poor. And in that case, and about large corporations that just happen to be meat packers. The book did incite outrage, not about the fate of the workers, but about food safety and the fate of readers disgusted by what they were learning about how their food was produced. And Sinclair said, and this is what I think Eric probably can identify with, I aimed at America's heart and I hit its stomach. Something similar happened to Eric. But he's been working very hard to shift the focus of his audience and the food movement to the social justice issues that are tied to food. And that's what he's going to talk about tonight. He's worked very closely with the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, which is one of the most successful labor movements of our time, which few of us would be aware of, if not for Eric's writing and speaking and film producing. Eric's also worked on these issues in other media as a producer and screenwriter on the film of Fast Food Nation, which was directed by Richard Linklater, and as a producer on the documentary Food Inc., which was nominated for an Academy Award, and most recently on the movie Food Chains, which you may not have heard about, but I commend to you as a terrific documentary about labor in the food system. And it's about the Coalition of Immokalee Workers. Since Fast Food Nation, he's published Reefer Madness, a portrait of the underground economy in America, and most recently, Command and Control, a terrifying look at our nuclear weapons complex. That was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in History last year. As for what he's working on now, well, you'll have a chance to ask him yourself. And Eric's going to speak for a little while and bring up then some very special guests. So please join me in welcoming Eric Schlosser.
Well, thank you for having me. And one of the great things about withdrawing in large part from the food movement is that Michael Pollan and I agree on 99.9% of things. And he is an incredibly eloquent and powerful spokesperson for this movement. And Michael, those were very nice things that you just said. I wonder now, how many of you were forced to read Fast Food Nation? That's a pretty high percentage. And I'm grateful to Michael because in the last couple of years, without any public fanfare, privately, he's worked hard to help farm workers in this country and has done a number of things beneath the radar that have had a real significant impact on moving this issue forward. Again, privately, without seeking any attention for it, and it's made a real difference. Tonight I'm going to talk about what I consider to be the most important part of our food system and the most important part of this movement that's arisen around our food system. This year is actually the 20th anniversary of my getting involved as a writer in food issues and in food activism. And I'm really proud to have played some role in helping to fuel this modern food movement. And I'm really proud of the changes that I've seen in this country in the last 10 to 15 years when it comes to food. The greater awareness, the rise of the organic movement, the rise of local agriculture, just so much more interest in creating an alternative food system to the centralized, industrialized food system. And I've been very defensive of the food movement against criticisms from the industrial food movement that it's elitist, that the food movement really only appeals to a small, upper middle class, white segment of society that's interested in going gluten-free and eating it and buying things at Whole Foods. And my argument in defense of the food movement is that all powerful social movements have to begin somewhere. And when you look at the history of the abolition movement to get rid of slavery, or the women's rights movement, or the environmental movement, it often begins among the educated and the upper middle class. So that, to me, is not a fair criticism of today's American food movement. But I have to say there are aspects of the food movement today that do trouble me. And one of the things that troubles me the most is how hard it's been for 20 years now to get people interested in and active on the issue I care most about that pertains to food, which is how do we help the people who feed us, the hands that feed us, the workers in this system. So, how did I get involved in food issues 20 years ago? Well, 20 years ago, there was a Republican governor of California who wanted to be president of the United States. And he thought the best way to become president of the United States would be to demonize and scapegoat the poorest, most vulnerable people in the state of California. He tried to create a movement demonizing undocumented immigrants in California. And his name was Pete Wilson, and he got a lot of attention. And his argument was that undocumented immigrants in California were parasites on the state's economy. They were welfare cheats. They were coming here to have babies and live off of taxpayers. And instinctively, that didn't feel like it was true to me. I was living in New York City at the time, but when I'd come to California, I had seen immigrant workers working really hard at all kinds of jobs that mainstream middle-class people didn't seem to want to do. So I started looking into, well, what was the role in, 20 years ago of undocumented workers in the California economy? And one of the things I found was that the number of migrant farm workers was soaring in California, that the great majority of migrant farm workers were undocumented, and that the agriculture that they were propping up was one of the most important sectors of the California economy. So I spent a year following the harvest of migrant farm workers in California and researching the role of migrant workers in this state economy, and then writing about it. And I wrote a long investigative piece on migrant farm workers using something that almost all of us love to eat but never think about, the strawberry, as something we take for granted, and yet behind every one of those strawberries that you see in the supermarket is a hand that carefully picked it. What did I see? I saw poverty on a scale that was almost unbelievable in late 20th century America. One of the most powerful places that I visited that had the most lasting impact on me was in northern San Diego County, which was gradually being suburbanized. So there were multi-million-dollar huge homes next to the strawberry fields, and in the hills above the strawberry fields, there were literally thousands of workers living in the hillsides. Some estimates were up to 15,000. And they were living in holes in the ground covered with garbage bags, and lean-to shacks made out of plywood, camouflaged so that they couldn't be seen because they lived in fear of the immigration authorities. And it was amazing to me that these workers who were working 10, 12 hours a day at one of the most difficult jobs imaginable were being demonized by this politician for political power. That was 20 years ago, and exactly the same thing is happening again. I saw garages where 10, 20 workers would stay, and I heard incredible stories about wage theft, about sexual harassment, about the real cost of almost all of our fresh fruits and vegetables. And it was that article that led to Fast Food Nation, because the editor of Rolling Stone read that article and invited me to his office and said, I would like you to do the same thing for fast food that you did for strawberries, which is to say, take this commodity, this food that we eat, and never think about it, and show all of the forces that go into its creation. And I wasn't really sure that I wanted to write about fast food because I liked eating it. And as anyone who knows me well can tell you, my food tastes are not very refined. And I really loved to eat hamburgers and French fries. And I didn't want to write an article that was just looking down at the food that most people like to eat. So I didn't take the assignment. I said I would think about it. And what I did is I went into the library and I started reading about the fast food industry and its history and its power and influence. And again, what really struck me most of all was how this industry was preying on the weak, on children, marketing highly unhealthy food to toddlers, but also how this industry was preying on workers, and how it had basically turned working at a restaurant into a terrible job, a low-pay job with no benefits, no unions, high turnover rate, how this industry had done everything it could to de-skill the workers in the restaurant industry. And most of all, how the fast food industry had fought again and again and again against any increase in the minimum wage. So even today, when you look at the fast food industry and the restaurant industry, there are about 10 million restaurant workers in the United States, and they are the largest group of minimum wage workers in the United States. And the minimum wage today, adjusted for inflation, is about 33% lower than it was 45 years ago. And what that means is, thanks to the fast food industry and the restaurant industry, the poorest workers in the United States have gotten a pay cut of 1/3, much to the profit of the fast food industry. It also led me into the slaughterhouses of the United States. And I saw terrible mistreatment of livestock, but what really haunted me was the mistreatment of the immigrant workers in those factories, those food factories, who were coming from a very similar labor pool from the migrant workers that I'd spent time with in California. And one of the moments when I knew that I wanted to do Fast Food Nation as a book was I was in the basement of a house in Lexington, Nebraska, and the house from the outside looked like this all-American house that Norman Rockwell might have painted, but in the basement there were about a dozen undocumented workers who were living crammed together, and one of the workers had worked at a strawberry farm that I had visited in California, and I saw how the same system for exploiting poor, vulnerable immigrant workers had migrated from the fields of California to the factories of the Midwest. And however hard the work is in the fields of California, the work in American meatpacking plants is unbelievably hard and dangerous, with the highest rate of injury of any occupation in the United States when I wrote Fast Food Nation. It's no longer the most dangerous job in the United States because the Bush administration changed the categories of injuries that needed to be reported, and by eliminating all repetitive stress injuries, serious shoulder injuries, wrist and back injuries, they greatly reduced the injury rate in meatpacking just by changing the form that needs to be filled out. And the meatpacking industry has not changed a great deal since the days of Upton Sinclair when he wrote The Jungle, because you can actually find a press release that the meatpacking industry put out celebrating the huge decline in meatpacking injuries without ever mentioning that all that had changed was the piece of paper that they were required to fill out to report injuries. So if you're an enlightened eater and you care about labor issues, it's possible now to just avoid fast food restaurants and not give money to the companies that are systematically mistreating their workers. And if you become a vegetarian, or if you decide to opt out of the industrial meat system, you can avoid giving money to the companies that are terribly, terribly abusing workers in the slaughterhouses of America. But then we come to the problem of, let's say you want to have a virtuous diet that's really the best diet for you to eat, based mainly on fresh fruits and fresh vegetables. Well, you're then going to become connected to labor abuses that are now in the 21st century that really belong to the 19th century. And I'm talking about what's happening in the fields of America. Michael mentioned a group I've been working with for more than a decade, the Coalition of Immokalee Workers. Immokalee is a small town in Florida in the heart of the tomato growing region. Right now, in the midst of winter, Florida is providing the majority of the tomatoes being eaten in the United States. And up until recently, there was slavery in Florida. And I thought that I saw terrible abuses in California, but the worst abuses that I've ever encountered were in Florida. Florida has a long history of being unfriendly to labor. Florida was the last state in the Union to get rid of convict labor, has been adamantly anti-union, and this new workforce of undocumented, mainly Latino workers has arrived in Florida without any real institutional support or groups helping them out until the Coalition of Immokalee Workers came along. So there were literally thousands of workers who became in debt to their smugglers and brought to Florida and traded to a labor contractor, and in order to pay off their smuggling fee, had to work for free. And when they tried to escape from the terrible working conditions in the field, they would be recaptured and beaten and literally kept in peonage. This group, the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, for the last 10 years, has pursued a remarkably innovative strategy, which is to realize that the farmers no longer have power in the agricultural system, but the large purchasers of agricultural products have the real power, the fast food chains, the supermarket chains. So rather than targeting farmers, this group has been targeting the real power and has been achieving enormous and important victories against some of the biggest and most powerful corporations, literally, in the world, and forcing McDonald's, and forcing Taco Bell, and forcing Burger King to be responsible for the treatment of their workers throughout the food chain. And these victories are just the biggest victories that farm workers have had since the days of Cesar Chavez and the United Farm Workers Union in the 1970s. So these are hugely significant victories. And the most significant of all this past year was with Walmart, and holding Walmart responsible for how workers who harvest food for Walmart are being treated in the fields. And at the same time that this farm worker group has been having these triumphs that I think will be written about someday in the history books of the United States, I've been trying to understand why it's been so difficult to bring attention to their work, and why it's been so difficult to create a mass movement in support of farm workers and meatpacking workers and restaurant workers. Before I came here tonight, I went back and looked at the New York Times archive to see how many articles have been written about the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, the most significant farm worker organization in almost half a century. In the last 10 years, there's been about 6 articles, and I wrote 2 of them. And that's not because I'm a great guy. I'm not telling you it's because I'm great. It just shows how hard it is to get attention to this issue. The New York Times no longer has a labor reporter, which means that working people aren't considered as important as style, as all the other subjects that are being reported upon. Now, in the last decade, the New York Times has published hundreds of restaurant reviews, hundreds of recipes, and maybe half a dozen articles on one of the most significant social groups in the United States. And there has never yet been a profile written of Lucas Benitez and Gerardo Reyes, who I think are the 2 most important labor leaders in agriculture of the last 50 years. New York Times has never done it. Washington Post has never done it. And in the last decade, the Washington Post has written 2 articles on this subject. And one of those articles was based on this documentary I was involved in this year. And I think the article was written because the documentary has a lovely and intelligent spokesperson, Eva Longoria, in it. And without Eva, I don't think the article would have been written. Now, I want to make clear to you, and if Michael had been 100% honest with you in the introduction to me, I am not here to tell you that I'm a great guy. Michael knows so many details I hope he'll be discreet about. And I am deeply flawed. But I'm trying to figure out why there is this unbelievable interest in food and so little interest in the people who are responsible for bringing us this food. It's incredible to me. And this is part of the danger, I think, in the current food movement. There are aspects of this food movement that are incredibly narcissistic and self-absorbed. And there are aspects of this food movement that see food essentially as a status symbol, and knowing the latest restaurant as a measure of your status, and the latest food fad. And for me, what this food movement needs to be is a broader movement that is concerned about how this food is affecting us when we eat it, but also how this food is affecting the community that we live in, and also how this food is affecting the society that we're a part of. That's the food movement that I really believe in. And Alice Waters, who has really created this course, she believed in it when she created the Edible Schoolyard, which is really devoted to teaching children about this system so that they can be healthy and really contributing to this community. And as the Edible Schoolyards have traveled across the country, contributing to this country. Ultimately, I think why we don't really know much about the restaurant workers, most people don't realize there's a separate minimum wage for restaurant workers who get tips. That minimum wage is $2.13 an hour. It hasn't increased for more than 2 decades, which means that the minimum wage for tipped workers has basically declined by 60 to 65% in the last 20 years. Most people in the United States are completely unaware and seem unconcerned with the plight of the meatpacking workers who bring them their steaks and their burgers, and farm workers who are responsible for the healthiest foods that we eat. And ultimately, I have to say, my conclusion is it ultimately comes down to racism. When you look at the history of agricultural labor in this country, it's a very dark history. This country was founded on slavery, and the original agricultural laborers in this state were Native Americans, and in the eastern part of the United States, they were African American slaves. And once slavery was ended in the South, there were various forms of sharecropping and debt peonage that were practically slavery for African Americans in the American South. And in California, there's a section of the piece that I wrote about agricultural workers, and it's called The Search for a Peasantry. And in this state, once they could no longer rely on Native Americans for harvest labor, there was a turn to the Chinese and Japanese and Filipino, and eventually mainly Latino workers. So I think ultimately this problem is tied to a bigger problem of racism in American society. And I think that if these farm workers were blonde and blue-eyed or Caucasian, we would not allow this sort of daily abuse to continue. So for me, improving the lives of food workers in this country is integrally connected to seeking racial justice in this country. They're all interconnected. So that's my view on it. That's my view as an investigative reporter and as an activist on the issue. But I'm very honored tonight to have some guests who are going to come up and give you a more first-hand view of this subject. I would love to have come up, and I apologize for mispronouncing names, Maricruz Ladino, Lisel Holdenride, and Marcela Ruiz. Lisel and Marcela are attorneys with California Rural Legal Assistance, and Maricruz is a farm worker who can give a better first-hand sense than I ever could of what it is to do probably the hardest job, one of the hardest jobs in the United States, and one of the most important and one of the most disrespected. So, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that introduction. My name is Marcela Ruiz, and I work with California Rural Legal Assistance. I have a few comments I want to make, but I really think it's more important that we hear from Maricruz and her personal experience first. So I'm going to cede the floor to Maricruz to share her story. Maricruz speaks some English, but she'd rather conduct her presentation in Spanish, so I will be interpreting for her.
Buenas tardes a todos. Gracias por invitarme y darme un poquito de espacio aquí para hablar con ustedes. Mi nombre es Maricruz Ladino, trabajadora del campo agrícola.
Good afternoon. Thank you for having me here and giving me the opportunity to speak with you. My name is Maricruz Ladino, and I am a farm worker. Maricruz, ¿quieres hablar sobre tu experiencia en el campo? Maricruz, do you want to talk to us about your experience in the fields?
Sí, el trabajo del campo para muchos es algo muy bajo, muy humilde. Para muchas personas es hasta humillante trabajar en el campo.
For the farm work, for some people, something seen as very low. It's even humiliating to work in the fields.
Para mí es algo que me ha dado la fuerza para sacar adelante a mis hijos y pues sí, nos escondemos un poquito de la demás gente porque recibimos muchas humillaciones y más es bien doloroso levantarnos a las 2 de la mañana, 2:30 de la mañana para prepararnos para llevar a nuestros hijos a dar a cuidar y empezar un día de trabajo a las 4 de la mañana y venir saliendo a veces hasta las 6, 7 de la tarde.
But for me, it's work that has helped me support my children and raise my children, but it is very difficult and it is very painful to get up at 2 o'clock in the morning to take your children to childcare so that you can start your job at 4 o'clock in the morning. Sometimes you don't get out until 6 p.m. at night.
Cuando dejamos todo el día a nuestros hijos por traerles alimento a la casa y darles un mejor estudio, un mejor porvenir para ellos, nada de las humillaciones que nos dan la gente nos interesa. Al contrario, a veces nos dan un poquito de fuerza, pero nos escondemos tapándonos la cara.
When you work all day to put food on the table and to give your child a better education, sometimes those humiliations that you receive from other people actually give you strength to keep moving forward. But there are times when you feel like you need to hide your face.
Tanto que nos humillan, tenemos que aguantar acoso sexual, falta de respeto, humillaciones. Dentro del trabajo, personas, los supervisores, nos amenazan muchas veces con despedirnos si no accedemos o no aceptamos proposiciones indecorosas.
We have to put up with sexual harassment and abuse, and our supervisors, they threaten to retaliate against us if we don't accept propositions from them.
Es bien difícil más yo en lo personal que tengo 3 hijas, que no cuidarlas de que no les llegue a pasar ya cuando estén grandes. Y mi mejor forma de protegerlas es trabajar duro, sean las horas que sean, dentro de tiempos fríos, de calor, de viento, de lluvia, para que ellas estudien. Ellos estudien es mi mejor regalo que puedo tener para que ellas nunca sufran esto.
It's very difficult when I think about my 3 daughters and wanting to protect them from something like this, having to work long days in the cold and the heat, but I think this is the best gift that I can give them so that they can have an education.
Lamentablemente, por mi experiencia, recibí humillaciones, he recibido humillaciones que me hicieron bajar la cabeza, esconderme, pero estoy aquí para hablar.
Unfortunately, because of my experience, I received a lot of humiliations, which made me put my head down and keep quiet, but I'm here to speak out. And it's very difficult. Maricruz was the plaintiff in a lawsuit against her supervisor, against the grower for sexual harassment. And so as you can see, it's a very difficult conversation for her to have. But before we came on stage, she was sharing how she has over time struggled with speaking up, speaking out, and the importance of it. It is a very personal decision that she made based on her own daughter's reactions and how she wants to teach her daughters to walk in this world. So, Maricruz, ¿quieres compartir un poco más?
Sí, bastante tiempo estuve callada por vergüenza.
I didn't say anything for a long time because I was ashamed.
Vergüenza a recibir más miradas feas de personas.
I was ashamed because I received ugly looks from others.
Por haber puesto una queja a muchos lugares para ir a buscar trabajo, me rechazaban.
Because I complained, a lot of places wouldn't hire me.
Disculpen, es un poquito difícil.
I'm sorry, this is a little difficult.
Lo que me ha hecho a mí ahora hablar es que una de mis 3 hijas, que yo siempre protegí, que no quería que llegaran a pasar esto.
The reason I decided to speak out was because one of my 3 daughters, who I always protected and to whom I didn't want this to ever happen,
hoy lo está viviendo en carne propia.
She's now living in the same situation.
De acosamiento sexual.
She's suffering from sexual harassment.
A ella casi yo no le hablé del problema que yo había estado pasando por miedo de sus reacciones.
I hadn't told her about the problem that I faced because I was scared of her reaction.
Pero miré que en callarme no voy a solucionar nada.
But I saw that I wouldn't solve anything by staying quiet.
Al contrario, estoy siendo una más de las, estaba siendo una más de las personas que estaba contribuyendo en que siguiera el acoso.
But on the contrary, by staying quiet, I was contributing to the ongoing harassment.
Hoy no, yo lo que quiero es hablar, buscar la manera de ayudar a más personas, porque así solamente voy a ayudarme a mí misma y a los demás.
But not anymore, because I want to find a way to help other people because that's the only way I'm going to be able to help myself and others. Thank you, Maricruz. Do you mind if I come up here for a second? Thank you. I can only talk when I'm on my feet. So I'm actually taking it for granted that all of us in this room know what happened to Maricruz is unjust and frankly inhumane. And I'm going to take it for granted that we believe that a just society would work to rectify and avoid these types of abuses. And I'll take it for granted that we believe that we live in the kind of society that would work to fix these problems and make sure they don't happen again. But the truth is, and I think it was so eloquently said by Eric, that what we heard today is not a description of an aberration. It is not a description of a supervisor or of an employer gone rogue, but it's rather something that happens all the time. And it happens all the time because we, as a society, we have created, through legal systems and structures, the rules and the conditions that allow these situations to be commonplace and, frankly, almost unavoidable. So my name is Marcela Ruiz. I am Deputy Director with California Rural Legal Assistance, and we, for the past 50 years, have been representing farm workers. We have had tremendous victories on behalf of farm workers, tremendous victories in improving the conditions of farm workers in the state of California. But still, every day, we hear heartbreaking stories like Maricruz's, people who come through the door with situations that you would imagine could not exist this day and age in this state. So I commend you, and I want to thank Eric for inviting us. I commend you because we should all be informed and curious consumers. We should ask where our food comes from, and we should also ask what systems or choices are tacitly supporting. At CRLA, our understanding of Maricruz's situation and that situation of other farm workers and why they fall victim to wage theft, sexual harassment, poor housing conditions, poor health, and all of the other conditions that plague California's 1 million farm workers is that it is complex. I think that Eric mentioned there are social issues at play that are well beyond my ability to talk about, like issues related to race. There are economic forces at play as well. But for us, we work in the legal capacity, and for us, there are two legal frameworks that kind of conspire to form the perfect storm to allow for situations like Maricruz to be commonplace. One is our employment law, the other is our immigration law. In terms of our employment law, we have a long, rich history as a nation of excluding farm workers from very basic protections. I think that we all, as employees or members of society, will take it for granted that all workers in this nation enjoy the same protections, and it's simply not true. From the very beginning, farm workers, amongst other workers, have been carved out from some of the protections that we think extend to all other workers. I don't know if how many people here can tell me where, after how many hours you're paid overtime in the state of California. 60 hours in a week. A regular worker, 40 hours. In a day, a non-farm worker, 8 hours. A farm worker, 10 hours. I think it's incumbent on us to ask why? Why when they're working out in the hot sun? Why when it's one of the types of work that has the most it can be some of the most dangerous work. Why do we not have laws that compensate farm workers in the same way that other workers are compensated? I mentioned that it's dangerous work, but yet only 13 states offer the same types of workers' compensation protections to farm workers that they do to all other workers. Half of the states don't have any protection. That means if I'm a farm worker and I'm hurt at work, I have no recourse under the law. The laws that protect and protect the right to organize do not extend to farm workers in the way that they extend to other farm workers. And in something that is the most challenging for us as attorneys, we have a system of subcontracting within farm labor that makes it almost impossible for us to really get at the actors that are driving the economic forces. Very often, when we file a lawsuit against a farm labor contractor, a small-time employer compared to the large agribusiness that's really kind of setting the standards for farm workers. But the way our legal system is set up, we cannot get at the larger employers. And that creates a situation in which we cannot hold the people who are liable and responsible and have the means to really make the changes responsibly liable using our legal system. So the other legal system at work here is immigration, our immigration laws. We don't know the true numbers, but I think it's commonly known that a significant percentage of farm workers are actually undocumented. And does anybody here know when the last comprehensive immigration reform took place? I think it was before some of you were born, right? 1986. 1986, so 30 years. It's gonna be 30 years. That means, 30 years, did I do my math right? Yes, 30 years. One more year, it'll be 30 years. That means we have people, farm workers living in this country who have been living in the United States for 20, 25 years who are undocumented. And it's interesting to me when I hear the commentary, well, why don't people just regularize? That's the vocabulary now. Why don't they just get a visa? Why don't they just become citizens? Because they can't. There is no legal means for any of those people to get a visa, to get a work permit, to become a legal permanent resident, to become a US citizen. Until Obama's recent executive order, most of those people didn't have a means of getting a work permit. And so what happens is you have in the agricultural industry a lot of employers who make it a point of hiring undocumented workers with the purpose of exploiting them, with the purpose of not paying their wages, with the purpose of acting with impunity. Now, I know that as a consumer, when you're standing in front of like those beautiful offerings at Berkeley Bowl, because they're beautiful, you don't know. You don't know if that fruit or vegetable that you're choosing was picked by somebody who was sexually harassed. You don't know if that worker was paid all of their wages. There is no way that you can know. That information is not available to you. So it's very hard right now, the way it stands, for you to influence change as an individual consumer. But I encourage you to continue to be curious about your food, because you're not just consumers, you're social actors. And there are other forums where you can voice what your principles are around food and what a just labor market should look like. Thank you.
So good evening. My name is Lisa Holdenreid, and I'm an attorney in our Salinas office. I've been with CRLA for about 6 years now, and the majority of my practice revolves around representing farm workers in employment discrimination cases. I would say that's about 85% of my practice, and then the remaining 15% deals with farm worker housing, the lack of farm worker housing, and a small percentage focuses on U visas, which allows us to represent farm workers who have been a victim of a crime like sexual assault in the workplace, and if that person is undocumented and they help law enforcement officials prosecute or investigate the case, then they are eligible to get a temporary visa for 4 years and eventually adjust their status. But like Marcella said, there really is no other recourse for undocumented farm workers to gain their legal status. So Eric asked me to talk to you a little bit about the type of cases that I work on primarily, and so I also do a lot of wage and hour cases. So what that means is, for example, I had represented about 13 workers recently in they were all guest workers. So what that means is that an employer has to tell the US Department of Labor that there's a shortage of workers, and then they apply to bring workers in from mostly Mexico, but also on the East Coast, Jamaica, and in Hawaii. Recently there was a case a huge case where there was some labor trafficking involved, and it was a lot of workers from Thailand. So, but mostly in California, employers are bringing workers from Mexico, and they're promising them that they are going to pay a certain wage rate, and the US Department of Labor sets that wage rate. And then they're supposed to pay all visa fees, they're supposed to pay travel expenses, they're supposed to pay for housing. And what I've seen in every one of my cases is that they don't pay for housing. They charge my clients for housing about $100, more than $100, $150 a month. So their weekly wages might be somewhere between $200 and $300, and they're paying $100 to $150 a month. They're paying something like $1,600 to $1,700 for expenses, visa fees, just employers trying to recover the costs of paying for that program. They're not paying the set wage rate. They're not paying for travel time, so oftentimes if workers have to get on a bus to go to the fields, they're not being paid for that time. That's wage theft. That's work being done by my clients, and it's not being compensated for. And this is just all fundamentally, it's just so, it's beyond unfair. It's just something that my clients are basically living on the financial edge. So each week that they aren't paid correctly, each week that they aren't paid at all, what often happens is that there's a promise, well, I'll pay you next week, and so they want to stick it out because it might be difficult to find another job. Or a lot of times my clients don't have a car, so they have to pay somebody to drive them to work. And so their job is tied to a means of transportation, and if they lose that means of transportation, or if they lose that job, they lose the transportation too. So what's even more, creates a more vulnerable situation for my clients is when their housing is tied to their employment. And what employers do not like it when workers complain. And so what I've seen many times, and it's actually it's hard to litigate, but we do it, is when cases of retaliation. So I have a client where we've now just reached a confidential settlement, but he was an irrigator, and he was exposed to pesticides, and his whole crew was exposed to pesticides, and he became very ill, and he started vomiting, and everybody exited the field, and they called their foreman, and they said, hey, we cannot go back in that field. It's been recently sprayed, and it's making us all sick. So he said, okay, hold on, I'm gonna call the supervisor. And they all use these kind of radios, so you can hear both people speaking back and forth. And so the supervisor says, oh, they're not gonna go back into the field? I want everybody's names, and I'm gonna talk to the boss, and we'll see who lasts till the end of the day. That's what happens. And you know what they did? They all went back into the fields, and they suffered through it. So my client went back in because he felt like he had no choice, and again, he became ill. And he said, listen, I need somebody to take me to the hospital. I'm really sick. And they said, no, just take a pill, take an aspirin, you'll be fine. So he drinks some soda, and then he falls to his knees and he begins to vomit. And at that time, his wife had just, you know, conveniently, she was bringing him some lunch, thank goodness. And he says, please take me to the hospital. And he ended up being out of work for 10 days. When he returned to work, during that time, the doctor, which was sort of amazing because this doesn't always happen, but the doctor reported the incident to the county ag commissioner's office. And so the county ag commissioner began an investigation. And so biologists went to the work site and started interviewing everybody. So it was very easily tied to my client, the fact that somebody had complained and it must have been my client. So when he got back after 10 days, he was removed from his crew that he had been working with for about 4 years and sent off to work on his own in an organic field. And they didn't provide him with any toilets. He said he had to walk like a half an hour in order to get to a toilet. They didn't provide him any water. And everybody sort of shunned him. And at the end of the day, he just couldn't tolerate that environment anymore, and he quit. And what we call that in sort of legal jargon is that that's a constructive discharge. It means that, you know, had it not been for the bad, insufferable conditions, my client wouldn't have quit. But a lot of times, people are forced to quit because the conditions are so bad. And so we're able to bring a cause of action for something like that and put a value on it. So another kind of category of cases, in fact, probably the largest category of my cases, has to do with sexual harassment. And unfortunately, I've had a very high number of sexual harassment cases that involve the most egregious form of sexual harassment, and that is rape and sexual assault in the fields. When these women come to me, when they finally get the courage, what often happens is that they don't come to me right away when something like that has happened, because they have to keep working. They have to keep working to feed their children. They have to keep working to pay rent. They have to keep working to put gas in their cars. And they have to keep working. Oftentimes they're supporting family in other places. And a lot of times my clients are at the head of the household. So they're single moms, and they're just working, they're just basically like living paycheck to paycheck. And they cannot afford, they have no cushion to just stop working for a week. They need every bit of money that they earn. So in one of my cases, most recently, my client was working for, as a raspberry picker. And she had been working for this company for since 2004. And she was really happy at her job. I mean, she didn't make a lot of money, but she liked what she did, and it was, remember she told when she testified, because the case ended up going to arbitration, she's like, well, it's easier than the lettuce, you know, so before, and she also, raspberry work is seasonal, so in the wintertime, she would have to go find work in the lettuce in Arizona, in Yuma. So raspberry picking was considered by her to be a better type of agricultural job. And so one season, she started to be harassed by a worker who he wasn't her supervisor. He was a coworker, and he started coming up to her, started, you know, kind of blocking her, impeding her access in the rows, inviting her out, sticking his phone number in her bucket, picking raspberries and putting it in her bucket. And she just kept saying, like, I'm not interested, go away. And finally, she becomes so nervous that she gets up the courage. And meanwhile, her husband, her estranged husband, is working nearby. Her son is working. She has children working there, and she's trying to protect everybody. And she's trying to protect herself, protect her family. She doesn't want her son getting upset and perhaps losing his temper and getting fired. And nobody, what I hear over and over again from my clients, nobody wants to be a troublemaker. They don't want to be that person. So she went to her foreman and she says, hey, this guy is bothering me. Okay, and that, women, my clients, do not go up to their bosses and say, hey, I think I'm being sexually harassed, and here's why. They say things like, this person is making me very uncomfortable, he's bothering me, I don't know why, he has no reason to be around me, I don't know why he's here. And all those are sort of, all those kind of statements should raise red flags to somebody to whom she's supposed to report these type of incidents to. They should raise red flags like, hey, this sounds like harassment. I need to look into this deeper. I need to take notes. I need to report this incident to the Human Resources Department. But somebody, a foreman, you know, with very limited education, himself or herself, isn't going to recognize that as sexual harassment unless the company invests money in his training. And employers have a duty to prevent sexual harassment in the workplace, and they have a duty to provide a workplace free of harassment. And so part and parcel of that duty is making sure that their supervisors are trained every 2 years, and when they hire a supervisor, that supervisor needs to be trained within 6 months of hire, and then thereafter every 2 years. And what happens is that employers also provide some training to the workforce, but what the training usually consists of is like a 5-minute, really brief little scenario like, hey, we have this law, the sexual harassment law. If you believe you're harassed, tell your supervisor. And then they go on into, you know, a long list of, you know, if you're injured at work, you better report immediately or you're going to be fired. Make sure to wear, you know, your personal protective gear. And it's just like this massive information that comes at people, and very little is spent on the topic of sexual harassment, how to report it, to whom they should report it, and there are very few options. So going back to this one client, this raspberry picker, what happened was that she did report it to her foreman, as she should have, and the next year they made him her boss. They made him her foreman, and there was no record that he had ever sexually harassed her in the previous year, and he ended up sexually assaulting her. He sent her to a row that had very few strawberries. It was very far away from the other rows. The rows were very dense, so you couldn't even see. They were so overgrown that you couldn't see to the end of the row. And So when she finally was able to get away from him and run into an area that was more public, she called her foreman, the supervisor, the assistant ranch manager, and she tells him what happened. Then he says, hold on, I got to call my supervisor. The ranch manager comes, another man. This person makes her tell her entire story all over again. She's got blood on her pants. Her button is ripped off. And they said, well, here's what's going to happen. I'm going to find the person that you said did this to you. And if he disputes it, then I'm going to bring you two in a room together, and we're going to all talk it out. And I don't know if anybody is as horrified as I am upon hearing that, but my mouth, I was just, it enraged me. Because these people had not been trained properly in how to deal with somebody that not only had just been harassed, but assaulted. So my client had to tell her story several more times. The employer was really kind of concerned with their image. She really had wanted to go to the police, but she was very deferential. They took this sort of culturally sort of deferential attitude that she had toward her supervisors as this sort of, that she was okay with what was going on and the process that they were forcing her to partake in. And what was amazing about this case is that she reported it right away, and the county did prosecute the guy, and he was sentenced to about 3 years in prison. But this is one of those really rare cases. Most of the time, sexual assault goes unreported, and the reasons that it goes unreported is that women are afraid that they're going to lose their job. A lot of times, they're told that they won't be believed. They're like, who's going to believe you? I'm the supervisor. A lot of times these supervisors have very, they're well respected. You know, this is what I heard over and over again. This man does his job so well that the employer just wanted to turn it. They just did not want to believe that this certain person could do such horrible things. And it's not just this one raspberry picker case. I hear the same sorts of scenarios from all of my clients working in lettuce, working in the berries, working in the vineyard fields. I have another rape case, believe it or not, where my client was working down in the southernmost part of Monterey County. She was tying vines. And so now now it's like one case ends and another case begins. And this is sort of the life of what goes on in our office. And I always think once, one case closes, it's going to be a long time. I pray it's going to be a long time before I have another one of these cases where, my clients are coming to me and they can't sleep at night. They have anxiety. They start to get panic when they've never ever had panic before because they think that they've seen their attacker somewhere out on the road. They break down in tears frequently and they say, Liesl, I don't understand, why did this happen to me? Why was I chosen? All I wanted to do was to work. All I wanted to do was to do my job well, and I don't understand. At the end of the day, with my client, who's a raspberry picker, she was a fighter. She's a fighter, much like Mary Cruz. Mary Cruz, just as a side note, was my very first case I got at CRLA. Mary Cruz is a fighter, and we fought together to make sure that the employer she worked for was held accountable. And so in the case with the raspberry picker, the case was we were not able to reach a settlement, and that company, rather large, forces all of its employees to sign arbitration agreements. And I don't know if anybody's ever read one of those, but they're actually pretty dense and complex. And so what happens is that their workforce is given a stack of papers upon hire, and they're just told to fill them out and sign them. And my client had a second grade education. She didn't read and write very well, and she did not know what it meant to sign away her rights to a jury and to bring an action in superior court or federal court. So we ended up going to arbitration, and soon that award will become public, but it was, I think, going to be a very historic case because she was awarded a very large sum of money, and the judge, the arbitrator, recognized that the company really needed to do better at training its supervisors and its workforce. And apart from the very significant monetary relief we were able to recover for our client, the judge awarded injunctive relief, meaning she's forcing the company to provide better training, better reporting systems, multiple avenues for reporting, and hopefully this will really create relief that impacts the entire workforce and reverberates across the agricultural community. Because the only way you can really teach businesses lessons is hitting them in the pocketbook, unfortunately. And so that's what we were able to do. So I guess that's pretty much all I had to say.
So I would like to say that the cases you've just heard are exceptions and unusual. And the only reason that they're unusual is that they were reported to an attorney and some form of justice may have been done. It's amazing and it's wonderful that there is so much attention being paid to rape on campus today. And I hope that same sort of concern for women's rights can now extend to the women at the bottom of society who are being harassed and assaulted at the highest rate in society. One survey of women farm workers found that 80% had experienced sexual harassment. And when you see women in the fields, they are generally covered in layers of bandanas, which I assumed at first was to keep dust out of their face and out of their nose, and is actually to shield their appearance from their co-workers. I'd like to say this is a new problem, but Michael started out by mentioning Upton Sinclair. One of the central plot elements of his famous novel, The Jungle, is the rape of an immigrant worker who must basically sleep with her supervisor in order to keep her job and protect her family. So I talked about earlier how race is a central issue involved here, and the other one is power. And you can see in our food workforce what happens when employers and companies have extraordinary power over their workers. All kinds of abuses are possible. So I'm going to end up very quickly, and then I'd love for there to be questions. And I want to end by saying this really doesn't have to be the reality at all. And what we need is strict enforcement of our labor laws, strict enforcement of our laws against sexual harassment. And if people were to ask what I think the single most important change that I would like to see happen that would transform our food system, I would say the transformation of the minimum wage into a living wage. I'm going to quote from Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was responsible originally for the minimum wage. "No business which depends for existence on paying less than living wages to its workers has any right to continue in the United States. By a living wage, I mean more than a subsistence level. I mean the wage for a decent living." I calculated what it would cost the typical family of 4 to make a living wage for every migrant worker in this country. It would add maybe $30, $35 a year to our food bill, which is less than a family of 4 going to see a movie. I'm delighted that there is an interest in celebrity chefs. I hope there will be soon an equal interest in the workers who harvest the foods that go into those meals. And for all of you, I hope you can take an interest in food that just extends beyond how it is going to affect your health, but take an interest in food in a way that takes into account how it affects the health of this society. We've heard a lot of disturbing stories, and this system is present in every bite that you take of this food. So thank you, and I hope you'll have all kinds of questions for us.
Hello. Thank you so much for everything that you guys shared. My question has to do with the labor in conventional versus organic farming. And I know there's been a lot of talk about how great organic farming is, and maybe for our bodies that is true as far as the pesticides go. But as far as labor is concerned, is there any difference behind the treatment of workers on organic farms and the treatment of workers on conventional farms? Because I know you mentioned the lack of toilets on the organic farm. That just got me thinking there must be the same kinds of abuses on organic farms as there are on conventional ones. And also with that, you know, should the focus really be on organic farming if there are these abuses that it kind of covers up?
I'll give a quick answer, and then I'd love for you guys to answer from your experience. The organic label does not take into account the working conditions at that farm. I think organic is better for the workers, and the reason that I try to buy organic isn't because I'm worried about what minute pesticide residues may do to my body, but in an organic field, the workers aren't being exposed to pesticides like they are in a conventional field. And there's some debate about the impact of minute pesticide residues on your health, but there's no debate about the impact of significant pesticide exposure to workers, and there are literally tens of thousands of farm workers who are sickened, like we heard in that story, every year by pesticide exposure. So the organic label is great, but it only goes so far. And I mean, have you guys seen?
Maricruz actually has worked in both, so maybe she can share her personal experience.
El trato, voy a decir que es parecido.
She said they treat us similarly.
Lo único diferente es, como lo estaba diciendo él, de que no estamos expuestos en lo orgánico, no estamos expuestos a los químicos.
The only difference is that with organic farms, we're not exposed to the chemicals.
Y en lo convencional, donde están usando el químico, estamos expuestos a llevar entre la ropa sin querer el químico, y no nomás nos va a perjudicar a uno, va a perjudicar a la familia.
And in conventional farms, sometimes we carry the chemical in our clothes, and so it causes exposure not just for ourselves, but for our families as well.
Yes, and we've definitely have many intakes. It doesn't matter if people are working on an organic farm or conventional farm. We see the same, like not being paid correctly. There might be everyone, I guess it should be just stated that everyone's at will, meaning they could be, they work at the, you know, the pleasure of the employer in a sense where, you know, they could be fired for anything except for a very limited protected category of things. So, yeah, we do see very little difference. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. That was incredibly moving. I'm curious, and I guess for Eric, beyond like going to law school or running for office, what can the rest of us do? I mean, I feel helpless over here. Is there a foundation, or, I mean, what can we do?
There are so many things that you can do. And there are all kinds of organizations that are trying to help migrant workers. And there are political candidates who care about these things and political candidates who don't. You know, the Coalition of Immokalee Workers is based in Florida, but they have a fair food campaign. They're coming up with a label that's going to be put on produce that's harvested under this fair food program. In the state of California, there's the United Farm Workers Union, there's CRLA, and I'm sure you can speak to things in this state where people can volunteer and get involved.
Absolutely. Well, I would be remiss not to mention CRLA again. There's CRLA, there's the UFW, there's one of the largest legalization processes that is coming up with, I mentioned the executive order that President Obama just announced. There's going to be need for countless volunteers to process millions of applications throughout the United States and hundreds of thousands probably in California. And having a regularized status or a work permit for farm workers, while it's not an answer to all of the problems, it goes a long way to help people be able to assert the rights that they do have when they don't have that fear of deportation also hanging over their head.
And I can tell you that when there's a battle between CRLA and the growers, the resources that the growers have are extraordinary versus CRLA and the small number of groups that are trying to help farm workers. And what's so sad is 40 years ago, in the 1970s, this was an issue that gained huge, huge support throughout society. And there were so many supporters of farm workers on college campuses, at supermarkets, and it's just been forgotten and shoved, you know, out of sight, and even in the food movement itself. So there are all kinds of ways that people can volunteer, and it's not even that you have to devote your whole life only to serving migrants, although some people do and deserve more admiration than I can say. But if everybody did something, some little thing, it's amazing how much change would happen.
Over here. Hi. Thank you all so much. And I just want to say to Mari Cruz, I really appreciate you being here. Your voice is a voice that we don't often get to hear, as Eric talked about, and I think that's unfortunate. So really appreciate you telling your story. And I want to hear from you. Eric mentioned his idea for the one most important thing. I know that this might be a hard decision to make because there's so much wrong in the industry right now, but what's the most important thing to you that you feel like needs to change?
Lo que tú consideras el cambio más importante que debe de haber en la agricultura. Eric había mencionado el cambio a los salarios, pero ¿qué piensas tú que es el cambio más importante?
El cambio más importante es ayudar a que nos den un poquito de más educación a todos los que integramos la parte de agricultura, ya sean los patrones, supervisores, mayordomos, a los mismos trabajadores, porque a veces estamos, como quien dice, con los ojos vendados, que no sabemos las leyes, no sabemos quiénes nos protegen. Entonces, una de mis principales cosas es de que encontremos la manera de educar más a las personas.
I think that the most important change that there can be is to provide more information or education to the bosses, to the supervisors, and including to the workers so that we can know more about our rights. Sometimes we operate kind of with blindfolds and we don't know what our rights are, so that's what I think is the most important change, to provide that education to farm workers.
Una de las cosas que yo quiero, que me he propuesto yo misma, es de hablar. La única manera, yo no tuve universidad, yo no tuve estudios, muchos, pero la única manera es de enseñar, de ayudar a enseñar a los demás, es con lo que yo viví. Y como dijo Lizo anteriormente, yo siempre me pregunté, ¿por qué me pasó a mí? ¿Por qué yo? Me escondía entre todo para que nadie me viera, pero al contrario, ahora ya encontré yo la manera, la respuesta, el por qué me pasó a mí, es para ayudar a ser mejor a todo el mundo.
I'm going to try. That was very moving. So one of my biggest goals, one of my biggest goals and resolutions was to speak out. For a long time, I didn't speak out, but now I've resolved to speak out and talk about what happened to me. And as Liesl said, I did ask myself, why me? Why did this happen to me? And now I understand that it happened to me so that I can speak out, so I can tell my story.
Also, thank you for sharing. I wanted to ask something like, from all the testimonies you've gathered, what do you think are the similarities and difference between working conditions in the US and in Central America?
De todos los testimonios, ¿cuáles son las
For me?
diferencias entre
Yeah.
trabajadores del campo de Estados
I
Unidos?
think that bad as things are in this country, they can be even worse in other countries. The LA Times did a really powerful series of articles recently about the abuses that are going on in Mexico. And bad as the wages are here, the wages in Oaxaca, the wages in parts of Mexico are a small fraction of that. So this is not a uniquely American problem, but in this country, in the 21st century, we set a certain sort of target of how people should be treated and how people should live, and it is worse in other countries, but we should be living up to our own ideals. And there shouldn't be two sets of laws, one set of laws for the privileged and one set of laws for the poor or the undocumented. And
I mean, I would just say undeniably, I think the conditions are worse in Central America, South America, North America, and Mexico. Maricruz and I were talking before we came on stage about how both of our parents, her father and my father, were braceros, came to the United States, and I think we grew up hearing the stories of our relatives coming to this country because of the crushing poverty that they experienced in Mexico and in Central America. And right now in Central America, it's not just the crushing poverty, but it's the high incidence of violence that people are subjected to, so that the levels of violence that they're sending their young children on their own to the United States. So there's no question that conditions are worse, and but as Eric said, I think we have a standard that we should be living up to, and we should be challenging ourselves to not meet that floor, but continue to be the standard bearers.
Yo en lo personal, yo soy de México, y una persona mayor, cuando yo tenía mis 18 años, me dijo, no sé qué estás haciendo aquí en México, aquí no tenemos para comer. En Estados Unidos somos pobres, pero tenemos para comer. En México no. En México batallamos.
She said, personally, I am from Mexico, and when I was 18, somebody told me, what are you doing here? Like, there's no food to eat here. In the United States, you can eat food. Here, there's no food for us to eat.
Can I follow up on that? Well, I actually have a farm in Mexico. I'm from there as well, and we actually have workers, and I've worked with them. And the thing that I see different is I don't think racism is the driver there. It's more like the economic gap, and well, the salary is way lower. And I just wanted to ask Maria Cruz if she thinks the same thing.
Dice que él tiene que él es agricultor en México y piensa que el racismo no es tanto allá como aquí, pero si los salarios son más bajos y quiere saber si tú opinas lo mismo.
Sí, yo opino lo mismo. Allá ahorita un salario por semana viene siendo quizás de 80 a 90 dólares por semana. Y sabemos que aquí no vivimos con 80, 90 dólares a la semana, necesitamos mucho más.
Yes, she says that I feel the same way. Back in Mexico, a minimum wage salary is $80, $90 per week, and here we can't live with that. We would need much, much more than that.
Other questions?
We have a question from social media. What are some of the barriers that immigrants face when they try to assimilate in the communities in the United States where they work? And then another question is, well, I guess that's the question.
¿Cuáles son las barreras que enfrentan los inmigrantes cuando tratan de asimilarse aquí en Estados Unidos? Si quieres contesto primero. So in our experience, two significant barriers are language. People don't speak English. They can't access the services that are available to them in the United States. And one of our programs focuses on the indigenous communities. So we have people coming not just from Latin America who speak Spanish, but who speak a variety of indigenous languages and are often categorized as Latinos or Latin Americans and spoken to in Spanish, despite the fact that they may not be fluent in Spanish. And then just not knowing the system. It's very difficult when you're in many of you have probably traveled abroad and you have that feeling of uncertainty. Where am I going to eat? How do you catch a cab here? Imagine if your whole life depended on it. How do I enroll my children in school? How do I access health care? How do I access transportation? What are the rules that protect me? It's this constant uncertainty of not knowing where to access services, what the rules are, what protections you do or do not have. And then, as I mentioned earlier, for many immigrants, it's also just the issue of the fear of being too vocal or asking too many questions because they don't have a status or working permit or any kind of authorization to be in the United States. So, aquí si quieres agregar algo.
Pues como dijiste, una de las cosas son hablar el idioma que aquí se habla, que es el inglés. Otra de las cosas es no tener papeles. Pues son las dos principales cosas que nos dan miedo.
The first thing is not speaking English, and the second thing is not having documents, and those are the two main concerns and why people are scared.
I was wondering what kind of immigration reform policies do you think would most quickly improve working conditions for immigrant workers?
I would support an amnesty and provide a method for the 10 to 12 million people who are here to gain legal status.
¿Qué tipo de reforma migratoria más ayudaría a los trabajadores agrícolas? Dice él apoyaría una amnistía.
Pues sí, nos ayudaría muchísimo, como dijo él, una amnistía para poder trabajar libremente, para estar libres y aprender a ser mejores.
Maria Cruz says that what would be the most helpful would be an amnesty so that we could move around freely and have more access.
Okay. I wanted to ask you, the Trans-Pacific Partnership appears to be rather challenging to workers' rights along the food supply chain. Do you have any comments about it or efforts that are being done to, from what I understand, it's using court mechanisms to effectively take away the legal challenges to these practices or to diminish them. Is anybody fighting this on behalf of the food system?
I can honestly say I know almost nothing about it.
I'm going to pass on that one. Maricruz. Maricruz passes too, sorry.
That is an answer.
Hi, I was just wondering, you're talking about how there's a long history of like structural and legal exclusion for farm and farm workers as far as the access. You were talking about like the amount of time, the amount of hours it takes in order to get overtime, like from 40 to 60 hours. And I was just wondering why, I'm trying to think about like historically, why you think that's been the case. Is it just like protecting the food source of the country, or if you could expound more on that, please.
Historically, it's because the Southern Democrats fought tooth and nail against the minimum wage and really didn't want, and there was support from Western growers, but in order to get the minimum wage law passed, Franklin Delano Roosevelt had to cut a deal that excluded all kinds of categories of workers, and farm workers most prominently. And so there has been a racial component to it from the very beginning. And in many ways, you know, there's still gender. There's a major gender component now to the minimum wage. When you look at the minimum wage for tipped workers being only $2.13 an hour, and something like 70 or 75% of the people who work in jobs that require tips are women, you know, there are all kinds of racist, sexist things that are historical that are still structurally embedded in the law.
I mean, it's I agree completely with Eric. I just want to comment on, I think, the myth that goes along with this notion that farm workers should somehow be excluded. We talk about, you know, the farm worker family who has their children working on the farm, like in their backyard. That's not what agriculture is in California. And I think we have to dispel that myth. We're not talking about changing laws that would regulate the family farmer. This is about agribusiness, billions of dollars in that industry. But I completely, you know, agree with what Eric has just said.
And I mean, just about this state produces the majority of fresh fruits and vegetables consumed in the United States. So what happens here has huge implication for the rest of the country. And we export, you know, particularly the strawberry industry exports a huge proportion of its production.
Hi, over here. Hi. Thank you all for coming. I just wanted to ask, I've always been interested in going to law school and have recently been really interested in how I can work the food movement into that, and just wanted to ask how you decided to channel your legal education in this direction, and if you think working as an attorney has really helped you feel that this was the best way for you to contribute to the movement.
Yes, well, my background was international human rights, and how I got into it, I had a friend working in Texas at Texas Rural Legal Aid, and had been working there since the early 80s, and she said, Liesl, if you want to do human rights work, you can do it in the United States, and it's with farm workers. And so I moved out from DC to Salinas, and my very first case, my very first week was Maricruz's case, and I was hooked. after that. Mari Cruz has made such a deep impact in my life. Her case, her strength, her voice, the way that I saw her fight, the way I saw her struggle, the way I saw her care and protect for her daughters. It moved me, and it's frustrating at times because we keep seeing the same crap happen over and over again. It pisses me off when I have opposing counsel that tries to value sexual harassment, the harm that my clients have suffered with their seasonal earnings. I think that's very racist. It disgusts me. And in fact, I told somebody that one time and he wasn't too happy with me. And so he tried to go over my head and talk to my male boss, who is so wonderful. He's like, nope, got to talk to Liesl. And so I feel like it's a really amazing way to, I don't think I could practice any other type of law. My heart just wouldn't be in it. And I think we've been able to make huge differences in people's lives. We've been able to impact changes in workforces. We're able to work on legislation if we get a special invitation to provide comments. So one of the things I was able to do last year was when Bill Monning was put forward legislation to change the farm labor contracting law that a lot of, as Marcella mentioned, a lot of abuses, a lot of sexual harassment happens under the authority of these farm labor contractors, and they're sort of fly by night. And they're not, if you think big companies aren't providing sexual harassment training in the way that they should, these little teeny farm labor contractor companies, they aren't doing much of anything. And so we were invited to give testimony. CRLA was, and I was a part of that. And so I found it a very rewarding way to make a difference in people's lives, whether it's big to them or small to them. It's just helping somebody stay with their families, get a measure of safety, find some calm back after a traumatic experience. It's one of the best things I could be doing with my life.
So I think for a lot of us who work in the social justice movement as attorneys, it's very personal, and I guess the decision for me to go to law school goes back to 1945. Not that I was alive in 1945, but my father was. So he was born in Mexico in a very, very small rural village in Michoacan, and he really kind of experienced that kind of crushing poverty that I had referenced earlier. Here was his social context. It was in the middle of land reform in Mexico, and his family decided not to take land because from the pulpits, the powers that be were saying taking land from the rich was like stealing. So his family did not take land. They were working another person's land. He was the youngest of 7. All of his siblings were illiterate. And my grandmother decided she wanted one of her children, to learn how to read and write. So he went to school. But when it was time for him to go to a secondary school, his father said, no more. We need him to work the land. So he left. He decided to become a mechanic's apprentice. And he told the story about how his brothers and father would go and bring him home so he could work the land, and he would keep running away. He was 13 years old. He was just a young man. And so he eventually came to the United States as a bracero and really talked to us about education. He worked as a farm worker, then he worked in a cannery for 33 years where they canned tomatoes. He had a union. And growing up, I didn't understand what it meant to have a union. And it was only years later, actually, after my father retired the year that I graduated from college, that I understood that he had a secure job, that he had good wages, that we had medical insurance, which is something that none of my other relatives had. And so to me, I think he told me the story over and over and over again, and it really taught me that individuals make decisions within these systems, but your life can be so shaped by these systems that are so much bigger than you and beyond you. And I see my father's case walk through the door. I see my cousins. I see all of my family's cases walk through the door. And I see people who are held hostage by these systems and their circumstances that are beyond their control. And for me, it is incredibly fulfilling to help these individuals assert their rights and maybe move the needle just a little bit, just a small enough amount that there's like one little measure of social justice in the world that didn't exist before we helped with that case.
And one thing I want to add is that California Rural Legal Assistance and Texas Rural Legal Aid, I've worked with them both, and it's amazing how agribusiness companies are constantly trying to eliminate their funding, which means they're definitely doing something right.
We are out of time, unfortunately. I think it's been an extraordinary evening. Please thank our speakers.